Welcome to the threshold. And I think we can all agree that we are at a threshold. I want to talk to you about grieving into hope. We're just a couple of weeks past the longest day of the year, but I got to tell you, it feels like we're in the darkest of nights. I'm not even thinking anymore what else, because we all know what happens when we anticipate a question like that. Instead, I'm reminding myself to be in the moment and to take life as it comes, not as an act of complacency, but an act of defiance, an act of hope, an act of transformation. I take life as it is so that I can be the light wherever I find myself, and that's important. I remind myself that in the dark, grief festers. I don't want to be part of the festering anymore. As my mother would remind me, no good comes of that. So I want to talk to you about grieving into hope. This is not the delicate, ephemeral hope made of whispers and spider webs. No, I'm going to really invite you to grieve in the dark, to be the flicker of hope within the dark. This isn't the hope of sunshine and roses, but the hope that has dirt on her face, blood on her knuckles, and the grit of cobblestones in her hair. Let's begin. So one of my favorite Carrie Newcomer songs is If Not Now, Tell Me When. And I often ask myself, if not now, when? Because it really feels like we're at a critical crossroads in our life. It feels more critical than any crossroads of the last 7 years. It feels like life has given us a barrage of one thing after another. And really, each of us can reflect upon our life. And I invite you to do that, to pinpoint when this most recent cascade of grief began, when you began to really grieve your loss. This loss can be something personal. It can be the loss of a loved one, a joy, a pet, and as you can hear, my pet has decided to join me today. It can be something that is uniquely yours to grieve. Now, these losses, while poignant, really impact us and those in our circle. I'm going to call this suffering contained grief. It doesn't reach past our circle of influence. We can ask others to support us, and those helpers show up objectively to hold space while we grieve. Then there is communal grief. It's the grief that ricochets off of each of us and burrows deeply into the collective consciousness. This is the grief that becomes a living, palatable, gritty thing. And really untethered, it takes on a life of its own. It festers until we're, quite frankly, overwhelmed. And lost in the dark, we cannot even articulate the question, if not now, much less answer it. But I want to return to personal grief. And I'm going to invite you to recall a grief. It can be one that's tempered by time or one that is still poignantly fresh. I'm going to invite you to sit with the grief. Really breathe into it. Ask yourself which of the stages of Elizabeth Kübler-Ross calls to you. Are you in denial? Are you angry? Do you feel the need to bargain? Are you depressed? Or have you reached that point in your life where you are accepting? So the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now I'm going to tell you, it really doesn't matter where you are for this exercise. What is important is that you identify the grief and where you are in your relationship with the grief. What I'm going to invite you to do is to really sit with that grief and how you named it. And I'm going to ask you to use your 5 senses to create a multisensory image of that grief. So as you sit with the grief, what does it look like? And breathe into the image you are given. What does it sound like? Again, breathe into the sound. What does it feel like? If you touched it, what would it feel like? What does it taste like? And yes, grief can have a taste. What does your grief smell like? Now, take all of those sensations together and create your multisensory image. And I'm going to invite you to hold it gently in the palm of your heart. And then ask it, grief, what would you tell me? And listen to the response. Now take the response and tuck it gently into a fold in your heart, knowing that you can return to it over and over again. Because to realize grief always has a message. And when we converse with grief, we're given a kernel of hope always. We just have to listen with all of our senses to gain that kernel of hope. I'm not going to lie to you, grief is complex. And once we acknowledge grief, we are no longer able to really ignore our suffering that's a result of the grief. If we play the game of hide and seek with our grief, grief always wins. It will find us over and over again until we realize that there really is no hiding from our grief. No matter what you think of grief, it really calls you to experience life. But the great thing is, in grief and all of its grittiness, it has a companion. That companion is named SelfCompassion. SelfCompassion is a gentle reminder that we cannot have life without loss. It's not here to erase the suffering. No, it calls us to find ways to alleviate suffering. And compassion, like grief, is an inside job. It begins with us, it's internal, and will help us to respond to the world externally in ways that we show up as ourselves. Now, if we can't alleviate the suffering caused by our own personal grief, how can we move into the collective consciousness to alleviate the suffering of a whole? Grief and hope begin with ourselves. So I can almost hear those gears in your head turning. So let's dig deeper, moving through your grief in order to help you help another. I'm going to tell you, you do not have to be grief-free or suffering-free to help someone else. You do not have to be at the acceptance phase of grief. You do have to begin the ongoing work of recognizing and being with your grief. And that's where self-compassion comes in. Because self-compassion is simply caring for you. Self-compassion says, I may not be able to change the trajectory of your actions, but I can minimize your suffering. Open yourself to me and really watch what happens. And that's important because as individuals, we grieve. And self-compassion asks us to surrender into the messiness of our life instead of ignoring the grief. Compassion asks us to face the grittiness with courage. When we get to the final stage of grief, acceptance. We accept the loss not because we want to, but because any other action would not have us be true to who we are at our core. This acceptance, again, is not the act of complacency, but an act of power. And only when we listen to the voice of loss do we discover the possibility of hope. within grief, within loss, is hope. And I cannot tell you that enough. Hope exists within our loss. Our loss makes room for hope if we only open our eyes to see it. And this is really the way of grieving into hope for an individual. So how do we grieve into hope as a community? I believe that as part of a community, each of us shares that, each of us has a kernel of hope that is fed by interactions within the community. I believe that each of us wants to be the change, even if that means that we're going to have to do the work of walking through, of slogging through just the quagmire of grief. That's the energy that each of us brings when we show up in community. The energy that will sustain us through the grief into a new way of life. It's about surrendering into the collective grief. So how do we start? It begins by being with one another, talking, lamenting over what is lost, purging the grief through your tears, being present to grief. And when those tears fall upon the ground of our collective soul, that's where magic happens. Those are not just toxic tears of grief. Think of them as compost for the collective garden. Within them is possibility. You work the compost into the soil, and then that compost, that toxic tears, change the landscape of our collective soul. They feed our hope until the collective hope pushes its fragile stems through the composted soil. And if we pay attention, we discover how hope manifests in the words and the actions of ourself and others. Because really, each of us in community find ourselves at different phases of grief. We share different energy with one another. We hold each other up, no matter where we find ourselves, what stage we find ourselves in of grief. We move through our grief into hope through one another, with our connections to each other. Now, I'm not going to kid you. This doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes community. It takes each of us. The African proverb that says, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes each of us to grieve into hope, and in doing so, change the world. So I'm going to issue an invitation to you to join in collectively grieving through hope, to join us in whatever way you can. Show up as yourself so that we can find the hope, and through that hope change the world. Thank you. Namaste.